There comes a moment in your healing when you stop asking, when will they get what they deserve? And you begin asking a much more important question, when will I finally get my life back? That shift may look small from the outside, but psychologically, it can represent one of the biggest turning points in your recovery. When you have been hurt by a person who manipulated you, deceived you, blamed you, invalidated you, or repeatedly made you question your own reality, it is completely understandable to wonder whether there will ever be consequences for what they did. You may look at them and think, how can someone hurt people like this and simply move on? You may see them smiling, posting pictures, entering another relationship, receiving praise, appearing successful, or behaving as though nothing happened, and a part of you may feel deeply confused. You may think, where is the justice? But today, I want you to look at this from a different perspective, because sometimes what we call karma is not a dramatic event. It is not necessarily a public collapse. It is not necessarily the moment when everyone discovers the truth. Sometimes karma is simply the natural consequence of living the same destructive patterns over and over again. Sometimes karma is losing people who were genuinely good to you. Sometimes karma is never experiencing the depth of intimacy you could have experienced if you had been capable of honesty and accountability. Sometimes karma is living inside a cycle that you refuse to break. And sometimes the greatest consequence is that the people you once controlled eventually become people you can no longer reach. If you have been dealing with narcissistic behavior, one of the most important things you can learn is that you do not need to become obsessed with the narcissist's downfall in order to heal. In fact, constantly waiting for their downfall can keep you psychologically connected to them. You may have physically left the relationship while mentally remaining trapped in the courtroom of your own mind, constantly presenting evidence, replaying conversations, imagining their future consequences, wondering whether they regret what they did, and waiting for some external event to validate your pain. But your healing begins when you understand that your life cannot be placed on hold, waiting for another person to receive a lesson. You cannot make your peace dependent upon their suffering. You cannot make your freedom dependent upon their apology. You cannot make your recovery dependent upon their recognition of what they did. If they eventually experience consequences, that is their journey. Your journey is different. Your journey is about becoming free. The word karma is often used to describe the idea that people eventually experience consequences for what they do. In an educational sense, we can understand this through something much more observable. Behavior has consequences. Patterns have consequences. Relationships have consequences. Choices have consequences. A person who repeatedly lies eventually creates an environment where people do not trust them. A person who repeatedly manipulates eventually creates emotional exhaustion in the people around them. A person who constantly demands attention while giving little genuine emotional reciprocity eventually becomes difficult to sustain a relationship with. A person who refuses accountability repeatedly creates conflict because every problem has to be somebody else's fault. This is not supernatural punishment. This is cause and effect. And when you understand that, you stop needing to predict exactly what will happen to the narcissist. You begin to understand that destructive behavior already contains its own consequences. Think about what happens when someone repeatedly burns bridges. At first, they may find another person. They may charm another friend. They may enter another relationship. They may find another workplace where they can create a favorable impression. They may reinvent themselves. They may tell a new story about who they are. And because people often meet the best version of someone first, the pattern may not be immediately obvious, but eventually, behavior begins to reveal itself. The same entitlement appears. The same inability to accept criticism appears. The same need for control appears. The same defensiveness appears. The same pattern of idealizing someone and later devaluing them appears. The same inability to tolerate boundaries appears. The same tendency to externalize blame appears. And eventually, the new relationship begins to resemble the old relationship. This is one of the most important lessons to understand. Changing the person around you does not automatically change the pattern inside you. You may have once believed that you were the problem because the narcissist convinced you that every conflict was caused by your sensitivity, your expectations, your reactions, your emotions, or your inability to understand them. But there is a difference between being imperfect in a relationship and being repeatedly subjected to dysfunctional patterns. Every human being makes mistakes. Every human being can become defensive. Every human being can say something hurtful and later regret it. The educational distinction is what happens afterward. Does the person reflect? Do they take responsibility? Do they repair the damage? Do they make meaningful changes? Or do they deny, minimize, blame, retaliate, and repeat the same behavior? That distinction matters enormously. A person does not have to be perfect to have a healthy relationship. They have to be capable of accountability. They have to be capable of hearing, "That hurt me," without immediately turning the conversation into an attack on the other person's character. They have to be capable of saying, "I was wrong." They have to be capable of tolerating another person's boundaries without experiencing those boundaries as an insult. They have to be capable of understanding that another human being is not an extension of themselves. When these capacities are repeatedly absent, relationships become increasingly unstable. And this is where the narcissist's so-called downfall may already be happening, even when you cannot see it. It may not look dramatic. It may look like emotional emptiness. It may look like shallow relationships. It may look like a series of friendships that never last. It may look like constantly needing admiration because internal security never develops. It may look like repeatedly starting over with new people. It may look like having many acquaintances but very few people who genuinely know them. It may look like surrounding themselves with people who validate them while avoiding anyone who challenges them. It may look like a life that appears impressive from the outside but feels increasingly fragile underneath. You have to be careful here because not every successful person is secretly miserable, and not every difficult person is destined for some spectacular collapse. Healing does not require us to make predictions about another person's future. What we can say is that destructive interpersonal patterns tend to create predictable relational consequences. And if those patterns remain unchanged, the consequences tend to follow the person wherever they go. That is why your goal should never be to become the person who finally destroys the narcissist. Your goal is to become the person the narcissist can no longer destroy. There is an enormous difference between those two goals. One keeps your attention focused outward. The other brings your attention home. One asks, "How can I make them suffer?" The other asks, "How can I stop suffering?" One keeps you connected to revenge. The other connects you to recovery. One makes their behavior the center of your life. The other makes your life the center of your life. Maybe you spent months or years trying to prove your worth. Maybe you tried to be kinder, more patient, more understanding, more attractive, more successful, more forgiving, more available, more supportive, or more loving, because you believed that eventually they would recognize what they had in you. Maybe you thought that if you just communicated differently, they would finally understand. Maybe you thought that if you explained the pain clearly enough, they would finally care. Maybe you thought that if you gave them one more chance, they would finally change. And perhaps the hardest lesson you have had to learn is that love cannot compensate for a person's unwillingness to take responsibility for themselves. You can love someone and still recognize that their behavior is harmful. You can understand someone's wounds without allowing those wounds to become your wounds. You can have compassion without surrendering your boundaries. You can forgive without reopening the door. You can wish someone well without giving them access to you. And you can stop hating someone without ever trusting them again. That is maturity. You do not have to become cruel to become free. You do not have to become narcissistic to survive narcissistic behavior. You do not have to manipulate the manipulator. You do not have to expose them to everyone. You do not have to convince every person who knows them. You do not have to win the argument. You do not have to make them regret losing you. You simply have to stop abandoning yourself. That may be the most powerful form of karma available to you, because when someone has conditioned you to constantly monitor their emotions, your freedom begins when you stop making their emotions your responsibility. When someone has conditioned you to explain yourself endlessly, your freedom begins when you realize that a boundary does not require a courtroom presentation. When someone has conditioned you to seek their approval, your freedom begins when you learn to approve of yourself. When someone has conditioned you to doubt your perceptions, your freedom begins when you reconnect with your own observations, values, and experiences. This is why boundaries can feel so powerful. A boundary is not a weapon. A boundary is information about what you will and will not participate in. It says, "This is what I will do if this behavior continues." It does not say, "I will control you." That distinction is important. You cannot control another adult. You can control your participation. You can choose whether you answer the phone. You can choose whether you engage in an argument. You can choose whether you continue a conversation that has become abusive or manipulative. You can choose whether you respond immediately. You can choose whether you provide personal information. You can choose whether you remain in the relationship. Your power is not in controlling the narcissist. Your power is in reclaiming control over yourself. And when you stop participating in the cycle, something changes. The old pattern cannot function in exactly the same way. If they provoke you and you no longer spend hours defending yourself, the interaction changes. If they attempt to create jealousy and you refuse to compete, the interaction changes. If they give you the silent treatment and you no longer chase them for reassurance, the interaction changes. If they attempt to pull you into an argument and you calmly disengage, the interaction changes. If they criticize you and you no longer treat their criticism as a verdict on your worth, the interaction changes. This does not mean the narcissistic person will suddenly become healthy. It does not mean they will necessarily accept your boundary gracefully. In some situations, attempts to establish boundaries can initially produce increased conflict, especially when the other person has become accustomed to access and control. That is why safety, practical planning, and appropriate professional support matter when someone is dealing with an abusive relationship. But psychologically, your internal shift is profound. You begin to understand that their reaction is not the measure of whether your boundary is valid. Ride that again in your heart. Their reaction is not the measure of whether your boundary is valid. Someone can become angry because you said no. That does not mean you were wrong to say no. Someone can accuse you of being selfish because you protected your time. That does not automatically mean you were selfish. Someone can call you cold because you stopped over-explaining. That does not mean you became cold. Someone can accuse you of changing because you started respecting yourself. Yes, you changed. You were supposed to. Healing changes people. The version of you who tolerated everything because you were terrified of losing someone cannot be the same version of you who learns to choose peace. And this is where the title of this message becomes meaningful. The narcissist's karma is already here does not need to mean that some cosmic punishment is waiting around the corner. Their consequences may already exist in the pattern itself. If someone continually destroys trust, trust becomes harder to build. If someone repeatedly rejects accountability, genuine repair becomes difficult. If someone treats people as interchangeable sources of validation, Meaningful intimacy becomes difficult. If someone cannot tolerate vulnerability, their relationships may remain emotionally shallow. If someone constantly needs admiration, they may become dependent on external validation. If someone repeatedly sabotages closeness whenever they feel criticized or exposed, they may continually recreate the loneliness they claim to fear. That is the paradox. The very strategies they use to protect themselves may create the isolation they were trying to avoid. The very control they use to prevent abandonment may drive people away. The very image they work so hard to protect may prevent genuine intimacy. The very refusal to admit vulnerability may keep them emotionally disconnected. The very blame they use to avoid shame may prevent growth. This is why consequences do not always arrive as dramatic punishment. Sometimes consequences arrive as repetition. The same relationship ending again. The same conflict happening again. The same people becoming distant again. The same accusations appearing again. The same emotional emptiness returning again. The same need for validation becoming stronger again. The same cycle restarting with a new person. And perhaps you have been wondering, why does it seem like they always get away with it? Because human beings do not always receive immediate consequences. Some people can avoid accountability for long periods. Some people are skilled at impression management. Some people are surrounded by people who have not yet seen the pattern. Some systems are imperfect. Some communities reward charisma more quickly than character. Some people are believed because they tell their story first. Some victims are not believed immediately. That is painful, but acknowledging it is part of becoming psychologically grounded. You do not have to believe that justice is always immediate in order to believe that your experience mattered. You do not need everyone to know the truth for the truth to be real. You do not need the narcissist to confess for the harm to have happened. You do not need their future suffering to prove that your suffering was legitimate. Your pain does not need a sequel in their life to become valid. This is where many survivors get stuck. They unconsciously make their healing conditional. I will feel better when they regret it. I will feel better when everyone knows. I will feel better when they apologize. I will feel better when their new relationship fails. I will feel better when they realize what they lost. But what if they never give you that moment? What if they never apologize? What if they never admit it? What if they tell a different story forever? What if some people believe them? Would that mean you cannot heal? No. Your healing cannot depend on an event you do not control. That is one of the greatest psychological freedoms you can discover. You can heal without their permission. You can move forward without their apology. You can rebuild without their approval. You can become happy without their regret. You can become whole without watching them fall. And once you understand this, something incredibly powerful happens. You stop measuring your progress by what happens to them. You start measuring your progress by what happens inside you. Maybe you sleep better. Maybe you no longer check their social media. Maybe you stop rehearsing conversations in your head. Maybe you stop trying to prove your innocence. Maybe you stop explaining your character. Maybe you stop wondering what their new partner thinks. Maybe you stop comparing yourself to the person who came after you. Maybe you stop asking whether they miss you. Maybe you stop needing to know what they are doing. That is progress, not because you have defeated them, because they are no longer occupying the central space in your mind. There was a time when their behavior could determine your entire emotional climate. If they were warm, you felt relief. If they were distant, you panicked. If they praised you, you felt valuable. If they criticized you, you questioned yourself. If they texted, your heart raced. If they disappeared, you became consumed by uncertainty. That is emotional captivity. And recovery means slowly taking the remote control back. You begin to understand that another person's attention is not your oxygen. Their approval is not your identity. Their affection is not your worth. Their rejection is not your destiny. Their silence is not a verdict. Their new relationship is not proof that you were the problem. Their public image is not the full truth of their private behavior. And their future is not your assignment. Your assignment is you, your nervous system, your boundaries, your values, your relationships, your goals, your health, your peace, your future. That is where your energy belongs. And perhaps this is the part you need to hear most. You do not have to become the villain in someone else's story to become the hero of your own. You may have been called selfish for having needs. You may have been called difficult for asking for respect. You may have been called unstable because you were reacting to prolonged emotional stress. You may have been told that you were too sensitive. You may have been accused of causing the very conflict you were trying to address. But now you have an opportunity to step outside the story they created about you and ask yourself a different question. Who am I when I am no longer trying to convince someone else of my worth? That question can change your life because perhaps you have spent years performing for someone who was never going to give you the validation you wanted. Perhaps you have spent years trying to earn something that should never have needed to be earned. Perhaps you have been trying to prove that you are lovable to someone who benefited from keeping you uncertain about whether you were lovable. And now you can stop. You can stop auditioning. You can stop performing. You can stop chasing. You can stop negotiating against yourself. You can stop shrinking. You can stop explaining every emotion. You can stop begging someone to understand what basic empathy should have allowed them to understand. You can begin building a life that does not require you to be constantly evaluated by another person's unstable standards. And that is not bitterness. That is freedom. There is another important lesson here. Sometimes people think that if they become completely indifferent to the narcissist, they have to stop caring about everything that happened. That is not true. Emotional detachment does not mean pretending the abuse did not matter. It means the event no longer controls your present. You can acknowledge that something harmed you without allowing it to define every future relationship. You can remember the lesson without reliving the pain every day. You can recognize the red flags without becoming suspicious of everyone. You can protect yourself without closing your heart to every human being. Healing is not becoming incapable of trust. Healing is learning how to trust yourself. That is a major difference. Maybe before this experience, you trusted people easily. Maybe afterward, you began questioning everyone. You wondered whether kindness was manipulation. You wondered whether affection was temporary. You wondered whether every compliment had an ulterior motive. You wondered whether every disagreement would become abandonment. That is understandable after relational trauma, but your goal is not to remain permanently guarded. Your goal is to develop discernment. There is a difference between being open and being naive. There is a difference between compassion and self-abandonment. There is a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. There is a difference between understanding someone and trusting them. There is a difference between giving someone another chance and giving them unlimited access. And there is a difference between being a good person and being available for mistreatment. You can be kind and have boundaries. You can be generous and say no. You can be forgiving and walk away. You can be loving and protect yourself. You can have empathy without becoming someone's emotional punching bag. That is the education your pain can give you. Your experience does not have to be meaningless just because it was painful. You can take wisdom from it. You can learn how manipulation feels. You can learn how your body responds to inconsistency. You can learn which boundaries you neglected. You can learn why you ignored certain red flags. You can learn why you stayed too long. And please hear this carefully. Learning why you stayed is not the same as blaming yourself for being mistreated. You stayed because you were human. You stayed because you hoped. You stayed because you loved. You stayed because you believed the good moments were real. You stayed because you wanted to repair what was broken. You stayed because you may not have had the information you have now. You stayed because leaving can be complicated. You stayed because psychological manipulation can distort your perception. You stayed because sometimes the person hurting you was also the person giving you moments of affection, creating an extremely confusing emotional environment. Do not use your present knowledge to punish your past self. Your past self was surviving with the information, resources, and emotional capacity available at that time, instead of saying, "How could I have been so stupid?" Say, "What was I trying to protect when I stayed?" Instead of saying, "Why didn't I see it?" Ask, "What made it difficult for me to trust what I was seeing?" Instead of saying, "Why did I tolerate that?" Ask, "What did I believe I had to sacrifice to keep the relationship?" These questions produce growth rather than shame, and growth is the real opposite of the narcissistic cycle. Because while someone who refuses accountability keeps repeating, you can learn. While someone keeps blaming, you can reflect. While someone keeps manipulating, you can become direct. While someone keeps demanding control, you can practice autonomy. While someone keeps performing an image, you can build authenticity. While someone keeps running from vulnerability, you can learn emotional honesty. You do not need to beat them at their game. You need to leave the game. That is the difference. Imagine spending the rest of your life trying to outsmart someone who has made manipulation a central part of their relationships. Why would you want that? Why would you want to spend your precious mental energy learning how to manipulate a manipulator? Why would you want revenge to become your personality? Why would you want anger to become the thing that keeps you connected? Your greatest victory is not becoming better at the game. Your greatest victory is realizing you no longer want to play. This is especially important when there are attempts to pull you back through what is sometimes called hoovering, efforts to reestablish contact, attention, emotional access, or influence. These efforts can take many forms. It may be a message that suddenly sounds sentimental. It may be an apology that contains no real accountability. It may be a crisis that makes you feel responsible. It may be nostalgia. It may be jealousy. It may be a sudden declaration that nobody ever understood them like you did. And because you are human, part of you may want to believe it. That does not make you weak. It means the attachment mattered to you. But emotional intensity is not the same thing as relational safety. A dramatic apology is not the same as sustained behavioral change. A promise is not the same as a pattern of accountability. Missing someone is not the same as being compatible with them. Chemistry is not the same as emotional health. And history is not the same as destiny. You are allowed to miss someone and still know they are not good for you. You are allowed to love someone and still leave. You are allowed to remember the good moments without rewriting the bad ones. You are allowed to grieve the person you hoped they would become. Sometimes, what you are grieving is not just a person. You are grieving a future that never happened. You are grieving the version of the relationship you imagined. You are grieving the promises. You are grieving the potential. You are grieving the hope that if you just loved enough, the relationship could become what you needed. That grief deserves compassion. Do not rush yourself through it. Healing is not a competition. You do not have to prove that you are over it. You do not have to pretend that you never cared. You do not have to become instantly happy after leaving. Sometimes freedom feels painful at first because you are no longer distracted by the cycle. When the chaos disappears, you may suddenly hear emotions that were buried underneath survival. Sadness may emerge. Anger may emerge. Loneliness may emerge. Confusion may emerge. That does not mean you made the wrong decision. It means your mind and body are processing what happened. And as you process it, you begin to understand something profound. Peace can feel unfamiliar when chaos was familiar. You may initially mistake peace for boredom. You may mistake stability for lack of chemistry. You may mistake consistency for something suspicious because you became accustomed to unpredictability. This is why healing requires patience. Your nervous system may have learned to anticipate emotional storms. It may have become highly sensitive to changes in tone, facial expressions, messages, and silence. You may have learned to scan for danger because unpredictability became normal. But over time, safety can become familiar too. You can learn that a healthy person does not punish you for having boundaries. You can learn that disagreement does not have to become emotional warfare. You can learn that someone can be disappointed without becoming cruel. You can learn that someone can say no without withdrawing love. You can learn that an apology can be followed by changed behavior. You can learn that affection does not have to be earned through self-sacrifice. You can learn that you do not have to walk on eggshells to maintain connection. And when you learn that, the narcissist's influence becomes smaller and smaller. That is the real downfall from your perspective, not their downfall, their influence. Because what once consumed 90% of your emotional attention may eventually consume 1%. What once made you cry may eventually become a lesson. What once made you question your worth may eventually teach you your worth. What once made you feel powerless may eventually teach you boundaries. What once made you afraid to speak may eventually teach you your voice. That transformation is extraordinary, and it is available to you. There is no guarantee that every narcissistic person will experience some dramatic collapse. There is no guarantee that the world will expose every harmful behavior. But there is something you can know with much greater certainty. You can change what happens next in your life. You can choose what access people have to you. You can choose which behaviors you tolerate. You can choose who receives your vulnerability. You can choose how quickly you trust. You can choose whether you continue conversations that become disrespectful. You can choose whether you keep checking the past. You can choose whether you spend your future trying to get justice from someone who may never provide it. And that choice is yours. Your life is not a waiting room for someone else's consequences. Your future does not have to be postponed until the narcissist falls. Your happiness does not have to wait for their apology. Your healing does not have to wait for their confession. Your freedom does not have to wait for their regret. Start now. Start with something small. Stop checking. Stop explaining. Stop chasing. Stop rehearsing. Stop comparing. Stop trying to understand every contradiction. Stop asking why they did what they did when the answer will not change what you need to do next. Sometimes you do not need another explanation. Sometimes you need a boundary. Sometimes you do not need closure from them. You need closure within yourself. Closure can be the decision to stop reopening the wound, Closure can be accepting that you may never receive the explanation you wanted. Closure can be recognizing that someone else's inability to love you properly was never evidence that you were unworthy of love. Closure can be saying, I understand enough to move forward. You do not need to know every detail of their psychology to know what behavior you will no longer accept. That is freedom. And if you find yourself still hoping they will realize what they lost, be gentle with yourself. That hope may be part of the attachment. But slowly, turn the question around. Instead of asking, when will they realize what they lost? Ask, when will I realize what I almost lost in myself? Because perhaps you almost lost your confidence. Perhaps you almost lost your voice. Perhaps you almost lost your ability to trust your instincts. Perhaps you almost lost your joy. Perhaps you almost lost your relationships with other people. Perhaps you almost lost years trying to solve a problem that was never yours alone to solve. Perhaps you almost lost the person you could become, and now you have a chance to come home to yourself. That is what I want you to understand when you hear the words, their downfall is set. Do not interpret that as a promise that something terrible will happen to another person. Interpret it as a declaration that destructive patterns have limits. Manipulation has limits. Control has limits. Charm has limits. Denial has limits. People have limits. Eventually, people become tired. Eventually, boundaries appear. Eventually, consequences accumulate. Eventually, some people walk away. Eventually, some people stop believing the explanation. Eventually, some people stop responding to the bait. Eventually, the narcissistic person encounters someone who does not participate in the old dynamic. And when that happens, the usual strategies may not work in the same way. But again, that is not your job to engineer. Your job is to become someone who is no longer available for the old dynamic. There is tremendous dignity in that. You do not have to announce your transformation. You do not have to post about your healing. You do not have to make indirect statements. You do not have to prove that you are happier. You do not have to make them jealous. You do not have to show them what they lost. Build your life quietly. Let your peace become private. Let your healing become personal. Let your boundaries become consistent. Let your future become bigger than your past. There is something powerful about no longer needing an audience for your recovery. You are not healing to make someone regret hurting you. You are healing because you deserve to experience yourself without constant emotional interference. And one day, you may wake up and realize that you have not thought about them for hours, then a day, then several days, then perhaps weeks, and you will notice something strange. The world continued. The sun still came up. You laughed again. You became interested in something again. You made plans again. You trusted someone again. You started dreaming again. You became curious about your future again. And suddenly, the question, what are they doing, becomes less interesting than, what am I building? That is the moment you know something has changed. Your attention has returned to you. And attention is one of the most valuable resources you have. Where you place your attention, you place your emotional energy. If your attention remains permanently fixed on the narcissist, your life remains psychologically organized around them. If your attention moves toward your healing, your relationships, your purpose, your creativity, your goals, your values, and your future, your life begins reorganizing itself around you. That is why no contact, when appropriate and safe, can be more than a communication strategy. It can become an opportunity to interrupt a cycle. But no contact is not magic. It does not guarantee that the other person will collapse, chase you, or suddenly become accountable. Its value is that it can create distance from a dynamic that was harming you. In situations where complete no contact is impossible because of children, work, family, legal matters, or other responsibilities, structured and limited communication may be more realistic. The principle remains the same. Protect your emotional and practical boundaries. You do not need to prove that you are stronger than them. You need to become stronger in your relationship with yourself. That means learning to tolerate discomfort without immediately reaching for the person who caused it. It means learning to sit with loneliness without interpreting loneliness as a command to return. It means learning to distinguish familiarity from safety. It means learning that missing someone does not mean you should contact them. It means learning that guilt does not always mean you did something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional residue of having been trained to prioritize someone else's needs over your own. When you first establish boundaries, you may feel guilty. Do it anyway, when the boundary is reasonable and safe. When you stop responding to manipulation, you may feel anxious. Breathe through it. When you stop explaining yourself, you may feel exposed. Remind yourself that you do not owe everyone unlimited access to your inner world. When someone calls you selfish for protecting yourself, remember that self-care and selfishness are not the same thing. Selfishness disregards the legitimate needs of others. Healthy self-protection recognizes that your needs matter too. You are allowed to matter. That sentence may sound simple, but for someone who has spent years in a narcissistic dynamic, it can be revolutionary. You are allowed to matter. Your exhaustion matters. Your time matters. Your boundaries matter. Your emotional safety matters. Your values matter. Your future matters. Your voice matters. And you do not have to convince the person who hurt you of any of these things. You can simply live accordingly. That is where the transformation begins. And perhaps one day, when you look back, you will not be grateful for the pain itself. You do not need to romanticize suffering, but you may be grateful for what you learned about yourself through surviving it. You may become more discerning. You may become more compassionate toward yourself. You may recognize unhealthy patterns earlier. You may understand that love should not require you to disappear, You may recognize that consistency matters more than intensity. You may recognize that actions matter more than promises. You may recognize that respect matters more than chemistry. You may recognize that emotional safety matters more than being chosen. You may recognize that being alone is sometimes healthier than being attached to someone who repeatedly harms you. These are not small lessons. They can change the entire trajectory of your life. So if you are sitting somewhere right now, wondering whether the narcissist will ever face consequences, I want you to take a breath and release the question for a moment. You do not know what their future holds. You do not need to know. You cannot control it. But you can control what you do with yours. You can decide that their choices will no longer dictate your emotional state. You can decide that their narrative will not become your identity. You can decide that their inability to recognize your value will not determine your value. You can decide that your future will not be a courtroom where you spend every day presenting evidence about your past. You can decide to stop waiting for justice and start creating peace. And if justice eventually comes in some form, you do not have to be there to witness it. You do not need a front row seat to someone else's consequences. You need a front row seat to your own life. Watch yourself heal. Watch yourself grow. Watch yourself become calmer. Watch yourself become wiser. Watch yourself become more selective. Watch yourself become emotionally independent. Watch yourself laugh without guilt. Watch yourself sleep without waiting for a message. Watch yourself make decisions without asking how someone else will react. Watch yourself become the person you were before you started questioning everything about yourself. And perhaps you will discover that the person you were trying so hard to get back was never actually gone. They were underneath the survival strategies, underneath the anxiety, underneath the confusion, underneath the constant explaining, underneath the fear. You were still there. And now you can come back. Not exactly the same, stronger in some ways, more discerning, more aware, more compassionate toward yourself, more protective of your peace, more willing to walk away from what repeatedly harms you. That is not becoming cold. That is becoming conscious. And consciousness changes everything. You begin to recognize that not every apology deserves access. Not every explanation deserves belief. Not every relationship deserves another chance. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every invitation deserves a response. Not every person who misses you deserves to have you back. This is what emotional maturity looks like. You stop asking only, "Do they want me?" You start asking, "Is this relationship healthy for me?" You stop asking, "Will they choose me?" You start asking, "Do their actions align with the kind of relationship I want?" You stop asking, "How can I make them understand?" You start asking, "What do I need to do to protect myself?" You stop asking, "What are they going to do next?" You start asking, "What am I going to do next?" That shift is enormous because you can Not control another person's psychology, but you can become deeply responsible for your own life. And that is where your power has always been. Maybe the narcissist made you believe your power was in convincing them. It was not. Maybe they made you believe your power was in being perfect. It was not. Maybe they made you believe your power was in keeping them happy. It was not. Your power is in knowing who you are. Your power is in honoring your boundaries. Your power is in choosing where your energy goes. Your power is in deciding what you will participate in. Your power is in leaving situations that repeatedly violate your values when you are able to do so safely. Your power is in building relationships where you do not have to earn basic respect. And your power is in realizing that you can survive someone else's disappointment. That last lesson can change your life. You can survive someone being angry with you. You can survive someone misunderstanding you. You can survive someone thinking you are the villain. You can survive someone leaving. You can survive being disliked. You can survive not being chosen. Because your life does not end when someone else withdraws their approval. Sometimes your life begins. So when you hear, the narcissist's karma is already here, let that phrase remind you of something deeper. Every pattern has consequences. But you do not have to spend your life monitoring those consequences. Let their life be their responsibility. Let your life be yours. If they refuse to grow, that is their responsibility. If they refuse accountability, that is their responsibility. If they repeat destructive patterns, that is their responsibility. If they lose people because of those patterns, that is their responsibility. You are not responsible for teaching them every lesson. You are not responsible for rescuing them from every consequence. You are not responsible for proving their character to the world. And you are certainly not responsible for sacrificing your peace so they can remain comfortable. Your responsibility is to yourself, to heal, to learn, to rebuild, to protect, to live. And perhaps the most beautiful part of your recovery is that eventually you stop needing the word karma at all because you realize something even more powerful. You don't need them to fall. You just need to rise. You don't need them to regret. You need to recover. You don't need them to apologize. You need to forgive yourself for the ways you abandoned yourself while trying to keep the relationship alive. You don't need them to admit your worth. You need to recognize it. You don't need them to lose. You need to stop losing yourself. That is the real victory. So today, if you are still waiting for their downfall, gently bring your attention back to yourself. Ask yourself what you can build in the next 6 months. Ask yourself what relationship with yourself you want to have 1 year from now. Ask yourself what boundary you already know you need. Ask yourself what part of your life has been neglected. Ask yourself what dream has been waiting while you were consumed by someone else's behavior. Ask yourself what peace would look like if you stopped trying to control an uncontrollable person. Then take one small step, not 10. 1. Make the appointment. Dim the number if that is appropriate. Stop checking the page. Talk to someone trustworthy. Write down the boundary. Return to the hobby. Go outside. Ret, eat, crepate. Pray if that is meaningful to you. Reflect, learn, build. The goal is not to transform your entire life overnight.